The blood-soaked legend of a man who refused to die in chains. There are stories buried so deep in American history that they feel like whispers from another world, tales so violent and visceral that they make your blood run cold and your heart pound with a mixture of horror and awe. This is one of those stories, a tale from the darkest chapter of American slavery, about a man whose name has been lost to time, but whose actions echoed through the Mississippi Delta like thunder that refused to fade. The year was 1850, and the Mississippi summer heat was suffocating, the kind of heat that makes the air shimmer and dance, that turns breathing into labor and makes every moment feel like an eternity. In the dense forests and swamplands of Mississippi, something was happening that terrified the white plantation owners and slave catchers who believed they owned everything and everyone in their dominion. A black enslaved man had escaped, and he wasn't just running. He was fighting back with a fury that seemed almost supernatural. They called him many things in the whispered conversations that spread like wildfire through the slave quarters and plantation mansions alike. Some said he was a demon. Others claimed he was an avenging angel sent to punish the wicked. But the truth was somehow even more powerful. He was just a man, a human being who had been pushed beyond every conceivable limit, who had decided that death was preferable to one more day in bondage, and who would take as many of his oppressors with him as he possibly could. Nobody knows his real name. That's the tragedy that cuts deepest, that makes this story pierce your soul with its injustice. History didn't bother to record the name of an enslaved man, even one who accomplished something so extraordinary that it became legend. The plantation records that might have contained his identity were likely destroyed or lost, and the oral traditions that kept his memory alive in the black community gradually faded as generations passed, and survival demanded forgetting the most painful memories. But we know what he did, and that knowledge is enough to make your hands shake and your throat tighten with emotion. The man had escaped from a plantation somewhere in the Mississippi Delta, that fertile crescent of land between the Mississippi and Yazoo rivers where cotton was king and human beings were treated as property no different from livestock. What drove him to escape? We can only imagine. Perhaps it was a beating that finally broke something inside him. Perhaps it was watching his wife or child sold away, torn from his arms by men who saw profit where he saw everything that made life worth living. Perhaps it was simply the accumulation of 10,000 small humiliations and cruelties that finally became too much for any human spirit to bear. The cotton fields stretched endlessly under that merciless sun, rows upon rows of white bowls that represented wealth for the plantation owners and agony for those forced to harvest them. From dawn until well past dusk, enslaved people worked those fields with bleeding hands and aching backs, knowing that any pause, any moment of weakness, would be met with the overseer's whip. The scars that crisscrossed their backs were a map of their suffering, each raised line a testament to the brutality of the system that bound them. Life on a Mississippi plantation in 1850 was designed to break the human spirit completely. The living quarters were cramped wooden shacks that offered little protection from the elements, places where entire families crowded together on dirt floors with barely enough space to lie down. The food was meager, just enough to keep bodies functioning, but never enough to satisfy the gnawing hunger that was a constant companion. Medical care was non-existent unless the enslaved person was valuable enough that their death would represent a significant financial loss to their owner. But it was the psychological torture that was perhaps most devastating. Every single day, enslaved people were reminded in countless ways that they were considered less than human, that their lives and loves and dreams meant nothing to the people who controlled their fate. Families were torn apart on a whim, sold off to different plantations with no regard for the bonds of love and kinship that held them together. Children were ripped from their mother's arms, husbands separated from wives, all in the name of profit and convenience. Into this hellish world, our unnamed hero lived and suffered and eventually reached his breaking point. We don't know the specific moment when something inside him transformed, when the fear that had kept him compliant finally gave way to a rage so pure and focused that it burned away everything else. But that moment came, and when it did, he made a decision that would change everything. When he ran, he didn't run scared. He didn't slink away in the night, hoping to avoid detection. Instead, he armed himself with whatever he could find, likely a combination of weapons he had stolen or fashioned himself. Some accounts suggest he had multiple firearms. Others say he relied primarily on knives and his bare hands, using the weapons of his pursuers against them once he'd killed them. What's certain is that he possessed both the skill and the determination to use these weapons with devastating effectiveness. Think about what it meant for an enslaved person to acquire weapons in 1850 Mississippi. The entire system was designed to keep enslaved people disarmed and helpless, to ensure they had no means of fighting back. Slave codes in every southern state made it illegal for enslaved people to possess firearms or even large knives. The penalties for violating these laws were severe, often involving brutal public whippings or worse. Yet somehow, this man had managed not only to acquire weapons, but to learn how to use them effectively, suggesting a level of planning and preparation that speaks to extraordinary intelligence and determination. The plantation owner did what all plantation owners did when valuable property escaped. He called in the slave catchers, those brutal mercenaries who made their living tracking down human beings and returning them to bondage, usually beaten within an inch of their lives as a lesson to others who might consider running. These weren't ordinary men. They were experts in tracking, skilled with weapons, comfortable with violence, and utterly devoid of mercy. They hunted human beings the way others hunted animals, and they took pride in their work. These slave catchers were professionals who understood the terrain, who knew all the tricks that runaways typically used, who had honed their craft through years of pursuing desperate people through the most hostile environments imaginable. They knew how to read broken branches and disturbed earth, how to anticipate where a fleeing person would go when they were exhausted and terrified and running on pure adrenaline. They knew how to use their dogs, vicious animals bred and trained specifically for this purpose, to track human scent across rivers and through swamps where other methods would fail. The dogs themselves were instruments of terror, carefully conditioned to be aggressive toward black people specifically. These weren't pets or even ordinary hunting dogs. They were weapons, trained to attack and hold their prey until the handlers could arrive to recapture or kill them. The sound of those dogs baying in the distance was enough to make enslaved people's blood run cold. A sound that meant someone had run and was now being hunted, would soon be caught, and made an example of to discourage others from attempting escape. 28 of them went into those woods. 28 armed white men, confident in their superiority, certain of their success, expecting this to be just another routine capture of another desperate, terrified runaway slave. They had dogs, the vicious hounds trained specifically to track the scent of black skin, animals that had been conditioned to see enslaved people as prey. They had rifles and pistols, knives and clubs, all the tools of their terrible trade. They had experience and numbers on their side. What they didn't have was any understanding of the kind of man they were hunting. He knew those woods and swamps better than they did. That was his first advantage. While they stumbled through unfamiliar territory, following trails that seemed obvious, he moved like a shadow, like something born from the land itself. He had scouted the terrain, identified choke points and ambush sites, places where the dense vegetation and treacherous ground would turn their numbers into a liability rather than an advantage. He was patient in a way that only someone with absolutely nothing left to lose can be patient. The Mississippi wilderness was treacherous even for those who knew it well. Dense undergrowth made movement difficult and visibility nearly impossible. Cypress swamps with water that could be anywhere from ankle deep to over your head without warning. Quicksand-like mud that could trap the unwary. Snakes and alligators that were every bit as dangerous as the human hunters. The heat and humidity were oppressive, draining strength and focus, making every hour feel like an eternity of suffering. But our hero knew this land intimately. Perhaps he had been assigned to hunt game for the plantation, giving him knowledge of the wilderness that most enslaved field workers would never have. Perhaps he had simply paid attention during whatever brief moments of freedom he'd been allowed, memorizing the landscape against a day when he might need that knowledge to survive. However he'd gained his understanding of the terrain, it now became his greatest weapon. The first hunters died quickly, efficiently, before they even knew what was happening. A knife across the throat from behind. A bullet fired from concealment, dropping a man before the sound even registered in his companion's ears. He took their weapons, their ammunition, their supplies. Each death made him stronger, better armed, more dangerous. The hunters began to realize they were no longer the predators. They had become the prey. Imagine the shock of that first kill, the moment when the hunters realized something was terribly wrong. They had expected to find a frightened runaway, someone who would try to hide or perhaps beg for mercy. Instead, they had stumbled into an ambush set by someone who knew exactly what they were doing, who had turned the tables so completely that the hunters were now the ones in mortal danger. The confusion and fear that must have spread through their ranks in those first moments would have been profound and destabilizing. Terror spread through their ranks like poison. These men who had instilled fear in countless enslaved people, who had built their reputations on cruelty and intimidation, suddenly found themselves experiencing that same paralyzing fear. The dogs that had tracked so confidently began to whimper and refuse to move forward. Grown men who had never hesitated to brutalize the defenseless started jumping at shadows, shooting at phantoms, turning on each other in their panic. The psychological transformation was complete and devastating. These slave catchers had always operated from a position of total dominance. They had weapons, numbers, legal authority, and the backing of the entire social structure of the South. They were accustomed to their victims being afraid of them, to having absolute power over the people they hunted. Now, suddenly, all of that certainty was gone. They were in hostile territory, facing an enemy they couldn't see, couldn't predict, and couldn't seem to stop no matter what they did. He picked them off one by one, sometimes in pairs when opportunity presented itself. He used their own tactics against them, setting traps that exploited their assumptions about what a runaway slave would or wouldn't do, could or couldn't accomplish. He attacked at night, when darkness was his ally and their fear reached its peak. He attacked during the day, when the oppressive heat exhausted them and made them careless. He was everywhere and nowhere, a ghost who bled them and melted back into the wilderness before they could respond. Each attack was calculated, deliberate, designed not just to kill but to demoralize. He understood that fear was as powerful a weapon as any gun or knife. By striking when they least expected it, by seeming to appear from nowhere and disappear just as quickly, he amplified their terror beyond what the physical danger alone would have created. They started to see him in every shadow, to hear his approach in every snapping twig, to imagine his presence around every bend in the trail. The psychological warfare was perhaps even more devastating than the physical violence. These men had to watch their companions die, had to wonder with each passing moment if they would be next, had to confront the terrifying reality that a man they had been taught to consider inferior was systematically destroying them. Every corpse they found was a testament to their vulnerability, every ambush a reminder that all their weapons and dogs and experience meant nothing against someone fighting with the desperate courage of a human being who had decided to die free rather than live enslaved. The ideology that had sustained the institution of slavery required white Southerners to believe that black people were inherently inferior, incapable of the kind of sophisticated thought and action that this man was demonstrating. Every move he made, every successful ambush, every calculated kill challenged that fundamental belief. It forced these slave catchers to confront the cognitive dissonance between what they had been taught about black people and what this particular black man was proving to be capable of doing. Some of the hunters tried to escape, to abandon the hunt and flee back to civilization. He hunted those men too, tracking them through the wilderness with the same relentless determination they had once used to track others. There would be no mercy, no quarter given. They had come into those woods to drag him back to hell, and he was going to make absolutely certain that none of them left to try again. Part 10. The men who attempted to flee likely thought they were making the smart choice, that discretion was the better part of valor, that there was no shame in retreating from an impossible situation. But our hero understood something crucial about allowing them to escape. Every man who made it back to tell the tale would bring more hunters, better prepared and more numerous. Every survivor represented the possibility of eventual recapture. And perhaps more importantly, every man who escaped without paying the price for what he'd come to do represented an injustice that couldn't be tolerated. So he pursued them with implacable determination. The men who ran discovered that running wasn't enough, that putting distance between themselves and the main group offered no safety. They learned that the man hunting them was faster, more skilled, more determined than they could possibly have imagined. They learned that there was no escape from the reckoning they had brought upon themselves when they agreed to hunt another human being for profit. The accounts that survived, passed down through generations, speak of a killing ground spread across miles of Mississippi wilderness, of bodies found days and weeks after the initial hunt had been called. The local authorities eventually stopped sending men into those woods. The price had become too high, the risk too great. For a time, that section of forest was considered cursed, a place where white men did not venture unless they had no choice. Think about what that meant in the context of 1850 Mississippi, a place and time where white supremacy was not just an ideology, but the foundational organizing principle of society. The idea that there was a place where white men were afraid to go because a black man had made it too dangerous was revolutionary, subversive, completely contrary to everything the social order was built upon. It represented a crack in the facade of absolute white dominance, a suggestion that perhaps the power dynamics everyone took for granted weren't as stable as they appeared. The stories that spread through the slave quarters took on a life of their own. Enslaved people who heard about what had happened understood its significance immediately. Here was proof that resistance was possible, that the system could be challenged, that one person with enough courage and determination could strike a meaningful blow against the machinery of oppression. The story became a source of hope and pride, something to hold onto during the darkest moments, a reminder that their oppressors were not invincible. What happened to him after those 28 men died? That's the part of the story that breaks your heart, even as it fills you with admiration for his incredible courage. Some versions say he was eventually killed, cornered by an even larger force that was willing to sacrifice however many men it took to bring him down. Other accounts suggest he escaped into the North, that he made it to freedom and lived out his days as a free man, carrying the weight of those deaths, but also the satisfaction of having struck such a devastating blow against the system that had enslaved. The most haunting version, the one that feels truest somehow, says that he simply disappeared into the deep wilderness, that he chose to live alone in those woods and swamps rather than risk recapture, becoming a legend whispered about in slave quarters across the South. A story that gave hope to the hopeless, that reminded people in chains that resistance was possible, that even the most oppressive system could be fought, that one man with nothing but determination and rage and love for freedom could shake the foundations of slavery itself. Imagine him in that wilderness, living off the land, surviving through skill and determination, knowing that he could never truly rest, never truly be safe, but also knowing that every day he remained free was a victory. Every sunrise he witnessed as a free man rather than a slave was worth whatever hardships came with that freedom. Living with the memories of what he'd done, the faces of the men he'd killed, the weight of all that violence, but also with the certainty that he'd been right to do it, that those men had forfeited any claim to mercy when they decided to make their living hunting other human beings. Think about what it took for him to do what he did. Think about the courage required to not just escape, but to turn and fight, to become the hunter instead of the hunted. Think about the skill necessary to survive in hostile wilderness, while simultaneously waging a one-man war against 28 armed and experienced trackers. Think about the psychological strength needed to kill that many men, to watch them die, to carry that weight on your soul, even as you knew with absolute certainty that every single one of them would have done worse to you without a moment's hesitation. The level of tactical sophistication he demonstrated is remarkable. This wasn't just random violence born of desperation. This was planned, executed with precision, showing an understanding of ambush tactics, terrain utilization, and psychological warfare that would have been impressive for any soldier of any era. He had to think several steps ahead, anticipating how the hunters would react to each attack, positioning himself to take advantage of their predictable responses, managing his limited resources while acquiring more from his fallen enemies. He had to overcome not just physical challenges, but psychological ones as well. Taking a human life, even in self-defense or in the pursuit of freedom, leaves scars on the soul. To kill 28 men, even men who absolutely deserved to die for what they were doing, would have required him to compartmentalize his humanity in some way, to become something harder and colder than he might have naturally been. The cost of that transformation, the way it must have changed him fundamentally, is part of the tragedy of his story. This story matters because it reveals a truth that the sanitized versions of American history often try to obscure. Enslaved people weren't passive victims waiting for white abolitionists to save them. They fought back constantly, in ways large and small, from subtle acts of resistance to outright rebellion. This unnamed man's story is extreme, but it represents something essential about the human spirit's refusal to be broken, about the lengths people will go to when fighting for their most basic human dignity and freedom. The narrative of slavery that many Americans grew up learning emphasized the cruelty of the system, but often portrayed enslaved people as helpless victims whose liberation came primarily through the actions of benevolent white people like Abraham Lincoln and the Union Army. While those actors certainly played important roles, that narrative erases the constant, ongoing resistance that enslaved people themselves engaged in, the rebellions large and small, the escapes, the acts of sabotage, the refusal to be completely broken no matter what was done to them. Our hero's story is part of that larger narrative of resistance. It stands alongside the stories of Nat Turner's rebellion, of Harriet Tubman's repeated journeys into slave territory to bring people to freedom, of the countless unnamed individuals who ran away, fought back, or found subtle ways to undermine the system that oppressed them. Each act of resistance, whether it involved killing 28 slave catchers or simply refusing to work at the pace demanded, was a declaration of humanity in the face of a system designed to deny that humanity. The legend of the man who killed 28 slave hunters in 1850 Mississippi is a story about the terrible price of slavery, not just for those who were enslaved, but for everyone caught in that evil system. Those hunters who died in the woods were products of their time and place, but they had made choices, had decided to make their living pursuing human beings and returning them to bondage. They paid for those choices with their lives, killed by a man who had finally decided he'd rather die fighting than live as property. It's worth noting that while we can understand these slave catchers as products of their culture and society, that understanding doesn't excuse their actions or make their deaths less justified. They weren't innocent bystanders caught up in circumstances beyond their control. They had actively chosen to participate in one of history's greatest evils, to profit directly from human suffering. They could have made different choices, could have refused to hunt other human beings no matter what financial incentive was offered. They chose otherwise, and they faced the consequences of that choice. It's also a story about how history remembers and forgets. That we know the approximate number of men he killed, but not his name, is an indictment of a society that valued property over people, that kept meticulous records of slave sales, but couldn't be bothered to record the names and stories of the enslaved themselves. How many other stories like this have been lost completely? How many acts of courage and resistance have disappeared into the void of historical amnesia because nobody with power thought they were worth recording? The archival gaps in our historical record when it comes to slavery are not accidents or oversights. They represent deliberate choices about what was considered important enough to preserve. Plantation owners kept detailed ledgers of their human property, noting purchases, sales, births, and deaths with the same dispassionate accounting they used for livestock. But the names, personalities, hopes, dreams, and acts of resistance of those enslaved people were considered irrelevant, not worth the ink and paper required to record them. Night came slowly, pressing in on the house. Plans were whispered in the dark. Prayers were spoken without sound. Beyond the horizon, armies moved, and with them, the future of the land and everyone bound to it. He lay awake long after midnight, staring at the ceiling, listening to every creak and distant voice. The road he had meant to take waited beyond the gates, still open, but narrowing by the hour. He told himself he would leave at dawn, but dawn was already on its way, and with it came consequences set in motion by a single touch, a quiet plea, and a moment of hesitation that would soon prove impossible to undo. The irony, of course, is that these harsh measures only made the need for resistance more acute, creating a cycle where oppression bred resistance, which bred more oppression, which bred more resistance. The slave-owning class was trapped by the internal contradictions of their own system. They needed to believe enslaved people were inferior to justify enslaving them. But every act of resistance demonstrated capabilities that contradicted that belief, requiring ever more elaborate justifications and ever more brutal methods of control. Imagine being an enslaved person hearing this story whispered in the quiet moments after the day's labor was done. Imagine the complex mix of emotions it would inspire. Pride that someone had fought back so successfully, sorrow for the desperation that had driven him to it, fear of the retribution that always followed such acts of resistance. Hope that maybe, just maybe, freedom was possible if you were brave enough and lucky enough and determined enough. This story was a form of resistance in itself, a refusal to let the oppressor's version of reality be the only version, a reminder that even in the darkest times, even under the most brutal systems, the human spirit could still rise up and fight. The telling and retelling of stories like this was an act of cultural preservation and resistance. In a world where enslaved people were forbidden from learning to read and write, where their cultural practices were suppressed and their family structures deliberately destroyed, oral tradition became the primary means of maintaining identity and passing down history. The stories that survived were the ones that people felt were important enough to risk telling, stories that spoke to shared experiences of suffering and survival, stories that kept hope alive in the darkest times. Our hero's story would have been told and retold, elaborated upon, maybe embellished in some details while the core truth remained intact. Each telling was an act of defiance, a way of saying that enslaved people's stories mattered, that their acts of resistance would be remembered even if the official historical record ignored them. The story became communal property, a shared piece of heritage that belonged to everyone who heard it and understood its significance. The Mississippi Delta in 1850 was one of the most oppressive places in one of the most oppressive systems humanity has ever created. The heat was unbearable, the work was backbreaking, the violence was constant, and the dehumanization was absolute and intentional. Into that hell stepped a man whose name we'll never know, who decided that enough was enough, who transformed himself from victim to warrior, who struck such a blow against his oppressors that they never forgot it even as they tried to erase him from history. The Delta's very geography was shaped by slavery. The fertile soil that made it so valuable for cotton production had been cleared and cultivated by enslaved labor. The levees that protected plantations from flooding were built by enslaved hands. The roads, the buildings, the entire infrastructure of wealth and power that defined the region was constructed through the forced labor of people who received nothing in return but suffering and bondage. The landscape itself was a monument to injustice. In that landscape of injustice, our hero carved out a space of freedom, however temporary, however costly. He took control of his own fate in the most dramatic way imaginable, refusing to be anyone's property, refusing to accept the role that society had assigned to him. In doing so, he demonstrated something fundamental about human nature that the architects of slavery desperately needed to deny: that people will always fight for freedom, that oppression will always breed resistance, that you cannot truly own another human being's soul, no matter how completely you control their body. His story survives because it means something, because it speaks to something deep in the human soul that recognizes and honors that kind of courage. We pass these stories down not because we celebrate violence for its own sake, but because we understand that sometimes violence is the only language oppressors understand, that sometimes the fight for freedom requires more than peaceful resistance, that sometimes the cost of dignity and liberty is measured in blood and sacrifice and unimaginable courage. The question of violence and resistance movements is complicated and has been debated by philosophers, activists, and historians for generations. There's nobility in peaceful resistance, in maintaining your humanity and moral high ground, even in the face of oppression. But there's also a point at which peaceful resistance becomes enabling, where turning the other cheek means simply allowing the beating to continue indefinitely. Our hero had reached that point. He had decided that he would rather die fighting than live in submission one more day. His choice of violence wasn't sadistic or cruel. By all accounts, his kills were efficient, tactical, focused on neutralizing threats rather than inflicting unnecessary suffering. He wasn't fighting out of hatred, though he would have been justified in hating the men who came to drag him back to slavery. He was fighting for something positive, fighting for freedom, fighting to reclaim the basic human dignity that had been stolen from him. The violence was a means to that end, not an end in itself. 28 men went into those Mississippi woods to capture one enslaved man. None of them came back. That's not just a historical footnote. That's a testament to what one human being can accomplish when pushed beyond all limits, when fighting for something more important than life itself, when transformed by desperation and determination into something approaching a force of nature. Those men learned too late that you cannot truly own another human being, that the chains you put on someone's body can never bind their spirit, and that sooner or later, someone will always rise up and fight back no matter the cost. The number 28 is significant beyond its simple arithmetic. Each of those deaths represented a choice by the victim to participate in slavery, a choice to hunt human beings for profit. Each death was a small crack in the facade of white supremacy's invincibility. Taken together, they represented a devastating blow to the psychological foundations of the slave system in that region. The fact that an entire group of professional slave catchers could be eliminated by a single enslaved man was a truth that contradicted every assumption the slave-owning class needed to believe about themselves and about the people they enslaved. The man who killed 28 slave hunters deserves to be remembered, deserves to have his name spoken with reverence, deserves to be honored as a hero of resistance and freedom. That we can't name him is a tragedy, but that we still tell his story 176 years later is a testament to the power of that story, to its ability to move us and inspire us, and remind us of both the worst and the best of what human beings are capable of when everything is on the line. His anonymity has become part of the story's power in an unexpected way. Because we don't know his name, he becomes every enslaved person who ever fought back, who ever resisted, who ever refused to accept their assigned role in an evil system. He becomes a symbol of collective resistance, a representative of all those whose names and stories were lost, but whose spirits were never broken. In his namelessness, he paradoxically becomes more universal, more accessible as a figure of inspiration for anyone who has ever faced oppression and chosen to fight rather than submit. And perhaps that's the most important lesson his story teaches us. That resistance is always possible, that oppression is never as absolute as it appears, that one person with courage and determination can make a difference no matter how overwhelming the odds appear. His story reminds us that freedom is worth fighting for, that dignity is worth dying for, and that the human spirit, when pushed to its limits, is capable of extraordinary things. In the end, the man who killed 28 slave hunters in the Mississippi Delta in 1850 remains a mystery in many ways. We don't know his name, we don't know exactly where he came from, we don't know his ultimate fate, but we know what he did, and we know what it meant. We know that he looked at the system that enslaved him and decided to fight, that he turned himself into a warrior, that he struck a blow for freedom that echoes down through the generations. His story is a gift to us, a reminder of the price our ancestors paid for their resistance, a testament to their courage and determination. It challenges us to honor their memory by continuing their fight in our own ways, by never accepting injustice, by always standing up for human dignity and freedom no matter the cost. That unnamed hero in the Mississippi woods showed us what's possible when someone decides that they've had enough, when they transform their pain and rage and love of freedom into action. And that's why his story will never die. Why we'll keep telling it as long as there are people who believe in freedom and justice and the indomitable nature of the human spirit. Because some stories are too important to forget, some acts of courage too extraordinary to let fade into silence. The man who killed 28 slave hunters earned his place in the permanent record of human resistance to oppression, and nothing, not even the erasure of his name from history, can take that away from him or from us.